What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Happy New Year to you all. It seems like it's been forever since we were live on this channel, but it's only been a couple of months. But, you know, I don't know about you, but I've missed it. I've missed you guys. I've missed doing this on a Monday. It feels like it's a kind of start to the week for me. It's a really nice thing to do to get the excitement going around Formula One. And, you know, I hope you'll agree that it feels to me like excitement is really ramping up right now in Formula One circles. We had the very first car reveal, sort of, with the Haas VF22. And for those asking, I desperately will try and do one of my little review videos that I've traditionally done on this YouTube channel. I will try and get that done. I'm just really busy right now. It's going to be slightly different this time of year, this time around, because whilst I really want to do videos on all the cars, and I will do, they may all come in chunks at the weekend when I manage to get round to it, because I have a full-time job these days. And there's a sentence I haven't uttered for a few years. But anyway, it will come. But either way, because of the Haas reveal and, of course, more car reveals later on this week, there is lots of excitement. It feels like we are properly back into it. And so it felt like the right time to get back on here. So thank you very much to all of you that have joined already. I know the chat has been in full flow for, well, it feels like a couple of hours now, which has been brilliant. I've dropped in and out a couple of times. It's really nice to see you guys chatting amongst yourselves as well. Tonight's show, really, I just want to take as many prompts from you. So as many questions as you've got, fire them in. I've got a couple already that people have sent me. There are some fairly obvious talking points as well, so we'll pick on some of those. And I mean, look, let's just see where it goes for the next hour. There's no agenda, there's no script. Let's just see what happens. You guys lead the way. Thank you very much wherever you're calling in from, tuning in from, all around the world, as always. Glenn Veazey says the kitchen's still not finished yet. No, this house is still very much a building site and probably will be for another few months yet, which is making it also really hard to find a place to record those videos. I'm even considering taking the company up on an offer of a hotel room later this week, just so that I can get into a room on my own without kids and family and dogs and building site mess, to be able to record some of those videos. So let's see what happens. So yes, this is still in the state of my house for a while. Yes, welcome to you all. So listen, shall we start by, let's start by just quickly touching on the Haas reveal, the first car that we've seen of the 2022 bunch. Now, I haven't done a full review on that yet. I haven't properly looked into it really, just because I still haven't had time. But I know it was a digital render. So, and this is going to be the case for a lot of these cars. In fact, probably all of these cars this year. We're going to see a version of what the 22 car looks like. But I think more so than ever, you're going to see details held back, either through slightly misleading renders or renders of a model from a very early stage in the development process. If you think about the renders that get released, they are a digital model. The teams have digital models built up of the car from much earlier on. And what they tend to do is they tend to, and this is not even specific to this year, but I think you'll see more of it this year because of the secrecy around the new technical regulations and their interpretation. You'll see earlier stages of the car being released to the public. So already right now, you could probably imagine that Haas car that we saw released to the world on Friday has already, inside the factory, moved on quite a lot since then, with a lot more updates, a lot more development as time has been spent in the simulators and wind tunnels. And by the time you see the cars on track in Barcelona, which is going to be really interesting, by the way, isn't it? The first time we get all of them together, I think they'll all be very different from the ones that get released in the digital images you'll find over the coming weeks. A couple of you didn't see the Haas reveal. Well, that's there you go. There's something to go and check out after this. It was sort of touted as a livery launch, but it was a 2022 car. It was different to the standard spec F1 model. So I suspect a lot of those details on that car are genuine 2022 versions of the car that Haas have come up with. Some interesting stuff, but I don't think until we see other cars, because there are such sweeping changes, it's going to be quite difficult to figure out what people are thinking, why they've done certain things, different interpretations of it. And perhaps that's another reason why, if I do leave the review videos till maybe the weekend, and this isn't out of choice, as I said, it's because of necessity, not having the time to do it. But if we get them at the weekend, I'll have 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 even by that point to start comparing. And that's going to be a much more interesting way of looking at it, I think, how different people have interpreted different things. You start to build a picture of what the philosophies are, or how people are, you know, looking at these regulations and where they think the opportunities might be. The cars are very different this year to last year. And I suppose let's start with this really. What are the biggest differences? I honestly think the biggest differences in the 2022 cars from a technical perspective are going to be the tyres and how the car itself, through its suspension system, manages the tyres. It's not something that we can see from these reveals particularly, of course, because most of the focus on those reviews of the cars will be around aero packages and the way the car is packaged and developed on a surface level. But the biggest change for me is going to be the tyres, and it's still a huge unknown. It's not something that we've got accurate models of yet. The only time they've really run on circuit was back in Abu Dhabi at the post-Abu Dhabi test. But that, of course, was on the 2021 cars, which are wildly different to the ones that we'll see racing this year. So we've got digital data modelling, but that's simulator-based at best. So there's nothing really to tell how the actual 2022 cars, with their completely revised suspension, will handle the new tyres, both from a perspective of they are a new compound, they're a completely new tyre developed by Pirelli, in theory with a slightly bigger operating window, the idea being that the drivers are able to push harder on them for the entirety of a stint, and so there's supposed to be built-in better warm-up capabilities, because of course, don't forget, over the next few years we're going to be moving away from tyre blankets. So increased warm-up on those new tyres, but also when you do push them too hard, or if you get a period of understeer or some massive wheel spin, what happened in the past was you got a massive spike in surface temperature. And as soon as you got that spike in surface temperature, the grip disappeared and you got into this vicious cycle. When the grip disappeared, the car starts to slide, increasing the surface temperature and so on and so on. And it would take a couple of laps of running slowly at way reduced pace to get those temperatures back under control, when you can then start to gradually build up to pushing again. Drivers hated that. It didn't really improve the show, and so Pirelli have tried to give a tyre that when you do get a bit of wheel spin or a bit of lateral slippage on the tyre, you don't get this massive surface temperature spike. They are, in theory, a bit more benign like that, which, you know, I suspect will be better in terms of what we want as fans, in that drivers are not having to manage the tyres in quite the same way. Of course, we're still going to have tyre management. That's always going to be a thing, but hopefully not in quite the same extreme levels, and particularly not as temperature sensitive as they were before. So there's that side of things, the new tyre compounds and the way that it operates, the way that the chemical compounds interact with the tarmac, but also the fact that they are shallower in terms of their sidewall height. They are larger in terms of their diameter, and they're also a lot heavier around the entire car. Well, they're not a lot heavier, they are heavier. But the sidewall height is actually a really big thing, because if you think about the old balloon tyres, a huge amount of the car's suspension travel was taken up in the squash of that tyre. Now, that tyre acts, going over bumps and curbs, like a spring, in that it absorbs energy and then it recoils and releases that energy again. And you get that bouncing of the car. You see it on the super slow-mo shots, don't you, in graphic detail? Well, the thing from an engineering perspective that's a nightmare about that is that that is completely uncontrollable spring movement from an engineering point of view. The team and the driver, other than not bouncing over curbs, have very little control over how that affects the car. You can control the car movement, of course, on springs and dampers and that kind of thing, anti-roll bars, but the tyre squish was something that was just a function of that big balloon tyre. Now what we've got is a tyre that has a lower sidewall, a lower profile sidewall. Not by a massive, huge amount, but significant, I would say, over what we've had in the past. That means you're going to get less of that squish, less of that compliance in the tyre, and therefore the teams have to completely revamp their suspension systems to be able to adapt to that. So a lot of the movement that was taken up by the squash of the tyre will now be moved inboard to the suspension systems. And the great thing from an engineering point about that is that that is under your control. You have capability to use things like dampers to control that bounce that you would not have been able to do before. So there's a whole new engineering challenge, but equally a whole new engineering opportunity from the fact that the tyres are different, and therefore the mechanical aspects of the car have to be different to cope with that. So, so I think that is a massive, massive undertaking that I think is underestimated by the casual viewer, because it's not necessarily particularly visible. Apart from the fact we can see the tyres and wheels are different sizes, I think we have most people have a very limited understanding of what that entails in terms of an engineering challenge. So I think that's massive. One of the biggest changes we've seen in the sport for a long time. And then, of course, on top of that, we have the aerodynamic changes, which is also massive too, because that underfloor, the move towards a preference of underfloor downforce creation, so generating a massively bigger proportion of the car's downforce from the underside of the floor and underside of the car, as opposed to previously when we still had a lot of it being generated by the diffuser and the underfloor, but actually the wings sat on top also played a huge role in that. Well, now we move to a much more heavily reliant downforce creation process from the underside. I see and hear a lot of people talking about these being ground effect cars and how we've moved to a ground effect philosophy. We haven't moved to a ground effect philosophy, because actually all of the airflow that happened underneath the car for years gone by has all been working in ground effect. Ground effect is simply the interaction of that flow between the squash between the surfaces of the underside of the car and the tarmac. Anytime that happens, when you get into close proximity, you move into this phenomenon called ground effect, where that flat surface of the racetrack interacts with the airflow and has an effect on it. All we're doing this year is putting more of that into play. We're using the underside of the floor in a much more sculpted way. You can sort of think about it, and this is a very simplified view, but you can think about it like this. And the old cars, the floor was relatively flat, but then had this diffuser that we all know about at the rear of the car, where it sort of ramps up towards the rear and it becomes an expansion chamber for that low pressure airflow that's being accelerated underneath the little gap between the bottom of the car and the racetrack. It then gets to the diffuser. As it opens out, that big expansion chamber draws all that airflow out from underneath the car, and that's where you accelerate the flow underneath and generate much of your downforce. Well, now all that's happening is we still have a diffuser, a little bit like the old ones, but we now have two great big Venturi tunnels along either side of the car, almost acting like separate, like second and third diffusers. They're not the same as diffusers, but they're acting in a similar way, in that they're utilising that airflow underneath the car in ground effect, speeding it up massively, which drops the pressure. As the airflow speeds up, it lowers the pressure. When you get pockets of low pressure, that generates downforce, because the airflow above it and above the car is at much higher pressure, and therefore it sucks the car down into the low pressure zone that's been created underneath. It's these big Venturi tunnels that are the new thing. So massively increased low pressure zone under the car, therefore much more downforce. And I'm waffling on here without looking at your comments, apologies, but I will come to them in a second. But the reason that we've gone in that direction, and forgive me if many of you know this already, the reason we've gone in that direction is because that downforce creation from the underside of the car is much less susceptible to turbulent air from the car in front, and also in conjunction with the wings and the diffuser and the lower beam wing at the rear of the car, everything designed to channel that turbulence, which will come out the back of the car, into a much more central zone, and then up and away, way up and above any chasing cars. The idea being that with the new rules, the cars behind, the cars chasing in a formation trying to catch the car in front, will be less affected by turbulent airflow coming off the car in front than they would previously, and therefore they lose a lot more of their downforce as a result when chasing another car. That's, in theory, the concept behind it all. I hope you've sort of followed on with that. I hope I didn't get lost there massively. or lose you massively in that. So the idea being that racing will be better. That's the upshot of all of this. That's the main reason we've gone to these new technical regulations, to try and improve the racing and the show. And on top of that, of course, we've got stricter budget caps. We've got aero resource restriction agreements, so a sliding scale of wind tunnel and CFD development, meaning that the team that won the Constructors' Championship, that is, so Mercedes, get less wind tunnel time and CFD time, aerodynamic research time as they call it, all the way down to the guys at the back that get a lot more. And that is significant this year when we've got such massive aerodynamic changes. So even if you take the front 2 or 3 teams, if you take Mercedes and Red Bull, let's say, if they pick up their rivalry this year in a similar vein that they left off last year, i.e. being as close as they were, well then the fact that Red Bull came second in the Constructors' Championship already means they have a reasonable amount more aerodynamic research time available to them this year than Mercedes do, in an era when we've got massive change in the aero front. So there's an immediate advantage or an immediate disadvantage to the team that won last year. Of course, the point of that is to try and close up the field. And if it works, then I'm all for it. I think it's great. So massive, massive change. Apologies, I've ignored you all, but let's come back to you. Massive change. We're on the brink of one of the biggest changes that I can remember in the history of the sport, certainly in my time, and I think for many years before that. There we go. Hang on, right, where are we? How do you think the more even distribution of aero downforce will affect racing? So good question, Harsha. So what Harsha's talking about there, which I didn't touch on, is this idea of the 2 Venturi tunnels and the increased reliance on the downforce production from underneath the floor. The other thing that's happened is these 2 Venturi tunnels are a lot further forward on the car than the old standard diffuser was that we had last year. Now you think about the centre of pressure, so the area where maximum low pressure sits under the car. It tends to be, and there's a couple of areas, but one of the areas is right at the throat of the diffuser. So just before it expands out into this big expansion chamber of the diffuser, that's where the flow is operating at its fastest. Now, that means that that's also the area of lowest pressure, and therefore you get a massive amount of downforce in that zone. Now, you think about where the old diffuser started, it was just around the sort of just ahead of the rear wheels of the car, quite rearwards on the car. So the diffuser and the underfloor aerodynamics produced a huge amount of downforce, but the centre of pressure, the centre of that downforce was very much rearward. This time around, we've got these 2 Venturi tunnels a lot further forward on the car, meaning that we're going to get low pressure zones right towards the front of the floor, just underneath the side pods or just behind the front of the side pods, a long way further forward than we had it before. So what Harsh was talking about there was the distribution of downforce is now much more balanced, i.e. not towards the rear, but much more towards the centre of the car. How will that affect things? Well, it will mean that, you know, in the past, because it was so rearward dominated in terms of downforce, the front wings used to have to be sort of heavily producing, although there were flow control devices, much more about directing airflow around the car, they also had to produce downforce to balance the car out. And if you lost some of that diffuser downforce, that underneath downforce, you would get a massive amount of, if you lost some of your front wing performance, you'd get massive amount of understeer because the centre of balance was so far rearward aerodynamically. So what I would say is this year you're going to have a much more balanced aerodynamic car, and therefore you can just use your front wing to maybe trim that balance rather than relying on massive downforce production in the same degree. The rear wing is not giving anywhere near the amount of downforce that it has with its new design, without the sort of end plates that we've become used to. In terms of racing, how will it affect racing? It's quite a difficult one to know that, to be honest. In terms of the cars, I mean, it's very difficult to say because I've heard people talking about driving the simulator. I think Lando Norris mentioned they look harder to drive, these cars. But much as I have total respect for Lando Norris, he's far better placed than me to decide this. It feels very early to decide that at this stage, given that, A, he must be only basing that off the simulator, I would imagine, which again, like I talked about tyres, there's no way of really accurately modelling tyres at this point. So it's very difficult, I think, for anyone to judge how difficult or easy the cars are going to be to drive, and therefore perhaps how that will affect racing. The idea behind it affecting racing is that we should get cars running closer together, or at least being able to run closer together, and in theory then be able to overtake each other a little bit easier. So we'll have to wait and see. It's a big unknown really at this point. That's the theory behind the rules, but until we see cars on track, it is kind of little more than a theory. Do you think the cars will look similar? So this is also tricky. So normally when you get a massive rule change like this, somebody will interpret the rules very differently to someone else, and quite often you get some weird innovation that might look wildly different. The difference this time around is that these regulations have all been dreamt up over quite a number of years now. Don't forget, we've had delays with these regulations, so they've been being worked on for a long time, but they've also been worked on by the teams, with a group from the teams also feeding into the rules generation process. Now that hasn't really happened in the past. So the idea behind all of that was the teams were looking for loopholes in the way the regs were worded to cancel them out early on, because they were trying to stop a kind of spending war on people finding new things. And you might say, well, look, if someone found a loophole, they're not going to shout about it and tell anyone. But of course, they don't know what anyone else has spotted. So a loophole that they might have seen might not actually be a particular loophole, because they might assume everyone else has seen it. So I think it will hopefully kind of work in that the regulations, they're pretty prescriptive, first of all. So there's much less scope for the teams to do things that are going to be wildly different, particularly from a bodywork perspective. Very restrictive on the boxes, the areas that you're allowed to develop in. So I think we're going to see small detail changes in certain areas. I don't think we're going to see a massive difference. And also, because of the fact that teams have already been part of the process to close loopholes, there seems less opportunity for someone to come up with some massive wild innovation that that might change the game and make them all look very different, I would have thought. How do you feel about the first pre-season test being private? Real shame. It's a real shame, isn't it? I mean, it's, you know, I know many of you look forward to it. I look forward to it as well, in terms of it's our first glimpse of the cars, and you know, it is a shame. Their sort of official line is that they have kept it behind closed doors for COVID reasons. But look, we'll have to just be patient and wait and see. We'll get pictures. I'm sure we'll get content coming out of those tests. But at some point, whether it's in the first week of testing or whether it's a little bit further down the line, we will get our moment where we all get to see these things together. And if we have to wait a few weeks, we're still going to get that moment. So maybe we just got to be patient. It's a shame though. Right. Do you think it'll be closer across the grid now due to the restricted rules and budget cap, says Ali H. Do you know what I do? And I think the budget cap will probably take a few years to really settle into having a major effect. It's definitely going to have an effect, of course, particularly for the big teams that were massively overspending, or, you know, doubling, tripling that figure. So they're clearly going to be affected, but they've already got a huge amount of resource in place. They've already got the best people, the best facilities in place. So there's going to be a lag in terms of they've still got an advantage with all those things that they've had over the past few years. I think the aerodynamic research restrictions are going to have an impact. And I think particularly in the first year, given the new regulations, that impact potentially could be significant. So that's that. And then the whole idea of the fact that these cars are going to be quite tightly restricted in terms of the way they're designed, I also think that's going to leave less opportunity for somebody to massively leap ahead. Power units are pretty much the same. In fact, the regulations are the same, but the teams have got one more opportunity ahead of the start of this season to bring an upgrade that will then be locked in place for the entire year. So, you know, I would expect we had pretty good parity on most of those power units last year, but there's still opportunity to bring those up even further. I think we might see some small incremental improvements from one or two of the teams, one or two of the engine manufacturers on that front. But I do think it will probably end up being closer, which of course is the whole point. And if it's closer and they can race each other harder as hoped for with this regulation set, well, look, I mean, as fans, isn't that just great? Isn't that what we want? We'll have to wait and see. So let's reserve judgment, I guess, until we get a bit more information. Right. In the Haas render, the Coke bottle area was much narrower. Based on that, do you think that Ferrari has managed to produce a better size and generally better PU? So, yeah, what's happened is, I mean, they may well have done. So, Amir, thanks for the question. Ferrari will have made some updates, and of course, Haas take the latest spec Ferrari engine for their car. So, Ferrari will have made some changes and some updates with the engine, absolutely. I think probably the bigger area here is that if you look at that, I'm doing this from memory now, but if you look at the top of the Haas, the top-down shot on the Haas, where you do kind of see a real pronounced slimming in of the Coke bottle area, I think what you're actually seeing is a much more bulbous front end of those side pods. You know, we've lost all of the barge boards from the cars, those complex array. I mean, you can't even call them barge boards at the end of last year. They were just an absolute art form, weren't they? Massively complex, flick ups and fins and winglets and all sorts of manner of pieces, multiple pieces making up that area. But that was hugely important to directing flow both under the floor, taking the tyre wake away from the car, sealing off the undersides, the outer edges of the floor, try and maximise the diffuser. Those elements have all gone from the car now. And yet the team still have, and also the blown axles are gone. So there's no more of that blowing airflow, scooping in for the brake duct, feeding it out through the centre of the axle or through the wheel, again to try and drag away that flow, the messy flow away from the car. That's all gone now. And yet the team still have that same problem. You know, the tyres are still a massive nightmare for aerodynamicists. They still create a really turbulent wake behind those tyres that causes problems further down the car. So they're still going to be looking for ways to minimise that and get rid of it. And so one of the areas that I can see that has a little bit of scope for development still in the regulations is the leading edge of the side pods. Now, obviously the entrance to these two Venturi tunnels, the sort of scoops, if you like, at the front of the floor are just underneath the side pod. So that's a critical area for feeding airflow underneath the car as much as possible. But above that, the side pod area, it may well be that a bigger frontal area almost, which seems counterintuitive, but a bigger frontal area, so loading the side pod area of the car or the engine bay of the car, if you like, with all the paraphernalia, the radiators and all the electronics and any other bits that sit in those side pods, by front loading that a little bit more, maybe going a bit wider, using that bodywork to help shape the airflow or the turbulent airflow away from the tyres and away from the floor might actually be one way to try and recover some of that. And I am saying that massive speculation. I actually have no idea if that's what they're doing. But just when I saw that top-down view, the Coke bottle seems slimmer, but it may well be that they've repackaged things a little bit further forward into a slightly wider formation. I mean, I will go through that in a bit more detail and try and have a look at it in a bit more depth and figure it out properly. But that could be one way that the teams are trying to overcome this idea of taking the messy, turbulent wake away from the car without the devices that they've been using to do that in the past. Right, sealing the floor, Miguel Cruz. Sealing the floor has always been, but this sealing the floor has been always, but this year with the Venturi tunnels, it will be very important. How do you think they're going to address the issue? Okay, so yeah, similarly, in terms of sealing of the outer edges of the floor to try and stop the higher pressure flowing in and messing up that flow path that went underneath the car, was always been critical, hasn't it? A huge amount of work on those barge boards or deflectors along the edges of the floor as well, trying to work to do that. This time around, because all those elements have now gone, but there are now some areas of the outer edge of the floor that are kind of mandated in the regulations, or certainly allowed within the regulations rather, that will help with that process too. There is a little sort of rolled, I don't know what you'd call it, a winglet that sits on the outer edge of the floor that, in previous years that area was restricted by the regulations, whereas this year there is scope to put something there by the look of it, and perhaps use that to help seal the floor. Again, I'm kind of speaking without really going into depth here, having seen the car properly, so apologies, but I do think that's how they're going to do it. Equally, they are allowed a small number of fins in the leading edge of the floor, so into that entrance to the two Venturi tunnels, you're allowed, I think it's 3 or possibly 4 vertical fins to help guide that flow underneath the car. Now, it could be that somebody might decide that they could use one of those, the outer edge of that fin, for a different purpose, to either try and somehow generate a vortex off the back of it, or to use it to help drive the wake away from the car, which of course goes against what the rules are trying to do. The reason that blown axles and these fancy end plates and barge boards have been restricted this year is because they don't want teams ejecting the messy turbulent wake out the sides of the car, which is what they've been trying to do in previous years, because that's what contributes to this massive zone of messy turbulent wake that affects the cars behind so dramatically. So now what they're trying to do is keep it all contained in a much smaller space, ejecting it in a narrow zone behind the car and then firing it up in the air. That's the basic theory of what they're trying to do. The teams will try to find ways to counteract that, because they still want to get rid of the messy wake, ideally eject it out the sides like they used to. So they'll be looking for ways. They've got much less opportunity to do that, but it may be that some of those things around the start of the floor and the bodywork around the front of the side boards might be a way to try and help with that, perhaps. The cars, oh, where's that gone? It's just jumped past. Sorry, I've missed that one there. I just saw a comment there which I was just halfway through reading, which said something along the lines of, the cars are going to be bigger and heavier this year. How is that going to affect racing on street circuits? Apologies if that's not exactly what you asked, but it was something like that. So yes, the cars are heavier, quite a lot heavier, about 38 kilos heavier this year to last year. That's a huge amount. 38 kilos is massive. Now, part of that comes, in fact, a lot of that, well, part of it comes from the larger wheel and tyre circumference. They're just bigger all round and add weight to the car. There are also some safety features off the back of Romain Grosjean's crash in Bahrain, the fireball crash. There have been some modifications to the way the fuel cell sits in the car and how that's mounted in the safety cell behind the driver. So all of those things have added weight. 38 kilos is the total amount over and above last year, which is big. Actually, the cars are going to be a bit shorter. They're not longer, they're shorter. So although they are heavier, the wheelbase, certainly for some of the longer wheelbase cars in the past, is going to be significantly less this year. In terms of being nimble around a street circuit, that in theory makes them easier. The weight, of course, counteracts that and will have the opposite effect. So I don't think we're going to have a huge problem on a street circuit, if that's what you're asking, but I'm sure it will have an effect. But these things are, tiny really in comparison to the effect that the tyres, the suspension, the way the aero works, those things are all going to have an even bigger effect than just the size and weight of the car, I would imagine. All right. Anyone else excited for the F1 Lego sets coming out? Yes, I am actually, yeah. I saw the McLaren one being advertised the other day. I'm definitely getting myself one of those. Obviously on the pretense that it's for the kids. Will we still, here we go, Daniel Pick. Will we still see high and low rake cars? Now, do you know what? I haven't spoken to an aerodynamicist in Formula One yet about this. And there are still, I think, two schools of thoughts, because you could sort of justify high or low rake both ways. My theory is that they will be much more low rake cars, or I don't think we'll see the extreme high rake that we saw before. And I also think that we'll probably certainly, this year get convergence on that, because there'll be a much more obvious solution. There is a way that you can justify the idea of a high rake car, because in theory, in the same way that the diffuser on the old cars could be exacerbated, if you like, could be increased, the performance could be increased by increasing the rake angle and therefore producing an even bigger expansion chamber for that flow to be drawn into. You could still apply that in theory to the Venturi tunnels on the underside of the floor. Now, the problem or the difficulty is where they sit, and we talked already about how that centre of pressure moves so much further forward. Because of that, and in that case, I suspect it's much more likely to be low rake across the board, or certainly not as high rake as we've seen before. It's going to be interesting. I mean, these are all speculative things, and without the knowledge of a full F1 aerodynamicist, without the tools and the resources and the data that they have at their fingertips, and of course having run these models in simulation to just simply find out what happens when you try both solutions, we don't have that capability. So this is based on theory at the moment, and this is such a big change that anyone who tells you they know exactly what's going to happen is just lying, because it's too big. As I said before, probably the biggest change, maybe even the biggest change technically that Formula One has ever had, season to season. Certainly the biggest change in my lifetime that I can remember, in this regard. And I think, it's going to be easy to sort of not quite appreciate how big a change it is just by looking at the cars. Because when you look at the cars, yes, they've got differences. Yes, they do look different. The wings are clearly different. There are some different shapes around bodywork. But actually they don't look as wildly different as the technology that's under the skin, really suggests they are. So I think it's just going to be a suck it and see, and that's why for me it's so interesting this year. I don't know how teams are going to interpret this and what effect that's going to have on the way the cars handle, the way they drive, the development curve throughout the year, and of course how the racing will be impacted. Right, hold on. As an aero nerd, I'm really disappointed that all the major design work will be hidden on the floor and in the tunnels. So G. Thompson, I kind of agree with you. It's a shame because fans, and let's talk about general fans that are armchair enthusiasts, maybe not the technical geeks and experts that I am, and I know many of you are, won't be able to see the big changes. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. Formula One's brilliance is in its technical development, its rate of development, the new updates that we bring to each race, which is a massive achievement and I think should be celebrated. And yet if no one can see them, do they care? Does your armchair fan actually care that some team has spent 1,000 hours and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds on developing a series of flick-ups that sit underneath the floor, or a new profile of your diffuser ramp or your Venturi tunnel? No one's going to care about it, and yet the teams are going to care massively because that's the performance differentiator. But if you can't see it on television, who cares? And that will be, I think, the viewpoint, which is a bit of a shame because it leaves those areas under-celebrated. They're going to be so top secret, no one will get to see them. Unless a car flips over in a race, which we don't really want to see, no one's going to get to see those things. So it's a shame in that regard. I totally agree with you. William Harris says, can we have a happy birthday for myself and Pierre Gasly and Yuki Tsunoda's mum? Absolutely, William. Happy birthday to all three of you. Yuki Tsunoda's mum, I'm sure she's watching. Pierre Gasly, and to you, William, happy birthday. All right. What are your thoughts on the changes in pit stops to make it a bit slower and taking away from sensors realising the cars? Do you think there'll be more changes? Well, I assume you're talking about the changes that came in halfway through last year. my view on all of that is, and I know that this is a view shared by many of my former colleagues and adversaries up and down the pit lane, because I speak to them all the time, they're disappointed. I'm disappointed that they came in. I don't think it made a massive difference. It's not, they're brought in on the grounds of safety, obviously. Now, it's often difficult to argue on anything that's brought in on safety grounds. However, I'm not sure I believe that those changes made a pit stop any more safe. The idea was that, a mechanic, for example, had to manually tell the system that the wheel nut was tight rather than it detecting it and doing it itself, which of course makes perfect sense in theory. You'd think that's got to be safer. But the reality is that these pit stops are still happening in just over 2 seconds. And I can tell you from experience, there's no time, that's muscle memory. There's no time to stop and double check if your wheel nut's 100% tight or correct before you trigger the switch. You go through a process, a muscle memory set of actions. You zip the nut on, you pull the trigger, and then you flick the switch. You don't pull the trigger, stop and have a good look to make sure it's tight, and then flick the switch. So I don't believe it actually made any difference to safety. And therefore, if we're not improving safety, and I personally don't believe we did in making that change, then we should go back to celebrating these massively impressive sub 2 second pit stops. For me, that's a massive feat of human endeavour to get 20 people to change 4 wheels and tyres in less than 2 seconds. That's something that Formula One should be jumping off the rooftops and shouting about. Not jumping off the rooftops, that was mixed analogies there, wasn't it? Shouting from the rooftops and jumping up and down. Don't jump off rooftops, guys. Right. Okay. Is it the end of Mercedes' dominance era, or still there is a chance that Mercedes will come back strong? Still every chance that Mercedes will still come back strong. Look, I still think the big teams will be the big teams. There might be some shuffling of the order, and there's opportunity to shuffle the order. There's definitely opportunity to close the pack. So for somebody like Haas, who was, probably 2.5 seconds off the pack on an average lap time, not off the pack, but off the lead, 2.5 seconds spread across the grid, front to rear, was pretty big. And if we can close that up, and that's, again, one of the intentions of these regulations, then in theory, that's going to improve the racing, because we're all close together and get more wheel-to-wheel action and more intensity throughout a race. So I don't think we're going to suddenly see a Mercedes drop to the back and a Haas take the World Championship. But there is opportunity for movement. But the big teams, as I said at the beginning, still have the biggest resource, still have the best people, still have the winning mentality. They still have all the things that made them winners in the past are still there. So there's no reason that anybody should be writing Mercedes or anybody else off at this point. It's a big unknown, but my feeling would be that the big boys are still going to be the big boys. My biggest hope, if you like, is Ferrari. Ferrari were on a sort of, I'd say, an upward curve in terms of their development and their performance. They have an opportunity to redevelop the engine, which they've done in fairly significant terms by the sound of it. And the new regulations give them a new opportunity to start afresh, just like everybody else, with a clean sheet of paper. They have got all the great people, they've got great resources, facilities, tooling, equipment, all those things, all the ingredients are there, and they've underperformed in recent years. With a new set of tyres and everything else, it could just fall towards Ferrari as having one of the biggest areas or biggest opportunities for improvement. So they're going to be a really interesting one to watch, I think. Aston Martin, dark horse, I think. Could well be, but this really is it. I think it's impossible to call, which is kind of great, isn't it? Isn't that what we want? If you go back over the past, 7-8 years, you wouldn't say it's impossible to call a rough order at this point of a season. Whereas I think this time around it's the biggest set of unknowns going into a Formula One season that I can remember. And, that's from everything, from team performance, from driver performance, which drivers are going to be able to adapt. There's a massively different driving style going to be required. from these cars, with the way the downforce is produced, with the way these tyres and the suspension are interacting with the tyres. It's a whole new ballgame from a driving perspective. There's going to be this idea of, you know, the way the downforce is produced and also the way the turbulent weight comes off the back of another car. That massively changes how you go about racing, maybe even how you slipstream. It may be that, you know, your slipstream opportunity is actually slightly different to the way it was before. i.e., you might be able to run much closer and get slipstream and hang on to that slipstream through the corners, which you could never do in the past because the loss of downforce would be too great to hang on to the car in front. You know, there may be different areas of turbulence at the race start, for example. How often have we seen Max Verstappen darting offline in the opening lap to get out of the way of turbulence of a car in front to generate downforce on his front wing as he goes through the first series of corners? He often thinks about where he can position his car to be outside of the turbulent wake. Well, that turbulent wake might be either gone or in a different place. It may be that right directly behind the car, for example, is where there's a bit more turbulence, and just offline, you've got a slightly cleaner air because of the way the airflow on the cars is being funneled in towards the centre line. So there might be different things that drivers have to think about, from everything from tyre temperature warm-up, tyre pressure control, you know, managing tyre life over a stint. And of course, all of these other things about learning to adapt the suspension, tweak the suspension, make changes over the course of a weekend to springs, dampers, roll bars, all of these kind of adjustables to get the best out of the car. There's also the idea that potentially, because so much downforce is being created underneath the car, that when you go over curbs or particularly bumpy circuits, it could be that the car becomes a bit more unstable as that gap between the floor and the car rises and lowers as we go over bumps and curbs. And if it rises and lowers, and that ground effect phenomenon I was talking about either is lost or gained as the gap becomes bigger and smaller, and therefore the gap that the airflow is going through becomes smaller or bigger, and therefore the airflow speed going through that gap slows and speeds up, and therefore the pressure changes off the back of that. The downforce could be a little bit more unpredictable. It's not going to be like back in the 70s when we had the side skirts on the car, and as soon as you clipped a curb and that side skirt left the racetrack and left a gap, you lost, you know, almost all of your downforce and the car spat itself off into the boonies. It's not going to be that dramatic, but there could be an effect along those lines, albeit much more benign. So we'll have to wait and see. Massive difference the way these cars will need to be driven and engineered, and who knows who's going to get their head around that quicker from a driver perspective and also a team perspective. Alright, is this the season with the best drivers ever? Hamilton, Max, Leclerc, Russell, Norris, all potential world champions. I mean, yeah, possibly. Yes, Sainz I would add into that. I'd love to see Daniel Ricciardo regaining form, getting his head around how to drive this car. I mean, that's another thing. Drivers that have struggled with the old way of doing things could be completely different. And on the flip side of that, if you think about, you know, Max Verstappen, or think about the Red Bull, Max Verstappen has dominated that Red Bull team for such a long period of time, and we've seen so many drivers come in and just not be able to drive that particular car to the same level he can. And yet you see someone like Pierre Gasly, who I happen to think is a fantastic driver, who's doing an incredible job at AlphaTauri in a much more sort of normal car, if you like, in terms of its behaviour and characteristics. How many times have we seen a driver not be able to do the same things as Max in that Red Bull? That would point towards the Red Bull having a specific set of characteristics, perhaps linked to the extreme high rake of the car, that Max's driving style absolutely suits, and the car has been tailored around that. Well, if we're now moving to a completely different aero philosophy, albeit one that's centred around underfloor aerodynamics, which is where Red Bull had their strengths, it's a very different way of looking at it. So, you know, could Max potentially lose some of that advantage compared to other drivers? I mean, it may be that it falls directly into line with the way Max drives a car, and it be others that suffer. Who knows? That's the big unknown with this. But there are so many unknowns, it makes it a really, really intriguing season. So yes, and iQuantum, sorry, I've just seen your question. Could we see certain drivers struggling more with these new cars than others? Absolutely. I think you will see that for sure. I mean, just like we saw drivers moving teams, Daniel Ricciardo, who really found his feet in the Renault, took him a year or two, didn't it, to get to grips with the way the Renault behaved, but he got to grips with it in the end, and then he's moved to McLaren and really struggled to get the best out of the McLaren. Sebastian Vettel struggled at Aston Martin, again moving to a different car with different characteristics. Well, none of them have made a switch as big as the switch that we're seeing for every driver this year with the new car. So absolutely, we'll see some drivers struggling and others get to grips with it more quickly. Others, it might just fall in line with their driving style. Like I say, it might suit them perfectly and others might struggle more. So yes, that is one of the big questions on the brink of this season. Make sure you get some good insulation in while you have the house in bits. Thank you very much for the tip. Yeah, there will be insulation going in. Yes, don't you worry about that. But thank you, appreciate that. Is this year going to be a year of locked-in engine dominance, or is this going to be a fight of aero dominance and engineering ingenuity? Says Roy Murphy. Well, there's always this risk, right? So engines are being locked in terms of once you've done your upgrade for the start of this season, that's it, it's then frozen. There's no more of this bringing upgrades as the season goes on. There is always the caveat that you have the opportunity, if you can prove it's for reliability grounds, you can bring some changes, but that's another story. So given that teams will all be bringing some upgrade to their engine, I would imagine there is a chance someone will do a better job than others. That's less likely to be dramatic because we are at a point now where these engines or these power units have been around for so long, we've got some level of convergence in terms of performance over the different power manufacturers. So I don't see a wildly different performance level. But, you know, whatever you bring at the start of this year, you are locked into. So that will or potentially could have an impact. Will it be aero or mechanical? I mean, it's always going to be a combination of the two. I don't think you can have one working without the other and vice versa. The only way you ever get a great Formula One car is with the entire package. And that's the engineering, the aerodynamics, the design, the build quality, the way it's engineered, to the little squidgy bit that sits in the middle and turns the wheel and presses the pedals. Everything has to be, that's what we used to call drivers, the squidgy bit in the middle. They're the only thing you couldn't really engineer. Everything has to be on point, and that's the only way you get a good package working properly. And so it will be the same again. It's just that they now have massive challenges in every single one of those areas that before had just been incremental evolutions. Now it's an absolute revolution. Where are we at? 5 minutes to go. Are we going to have to put up with more sprint races this season? Everyone I know doesn't like them, says Kev Hill. We are definitely going to have more sprint races this season. But I would reserve judgment on that. I think as an experiment last year, I took away from that there was some added excitement on tiny bits of it. It was very circuit dependent and weekend conditions dependent. The one thing I would say is that shall we just reserve judgment and see how these cars play out over the course of a sprint weekend, and let's see if that changes anything. The idea of being able to chase and follow and overtake might actually lend itself to the sprint format a little bit more. So maybe let's just give it a chance and see before we sort of turn our nose up too much. Kimi was engineered. Can you just up the settings on the engines, having them wear out faster and claim they need a reliability update? Well, you could, in theory, you could do that, but of course you take penalties, don't you, for, you've still got the limited number of engines like we had before. So if they don't last if they don't last for their required lifespan, you're going to take a penalty. So you're going to take a loss in that regard. And also, by cranking them up and introducing genuine reliability issues, you obviously risk the thing blowing up. So you could do it, but it probably doesn't make a huge amount of sense. Right, 5 minutes. Let's take one or two more. What about a quarter-mile drag competition instead of a sprint? That would be a very different car required for that. Is this the first time in a long time we only have one finished driver now? Yeah, probably is, isn't it? Yeah, probably is. You're right. Qualifying is better than sprints, as the excitement is always at the end instead of for the start of the sprint. Well, yeah, you still get qualifying, of course, on a sprint weekend, don't you? So you sort of get both. But yes, so look, I agree. There was lots wrong with the sprints. It didn't work in every regard, but it was being done as an experiment, and that experiment continues this year. I do think it makes a big difference where you do it. And they know they have a lot of data off the back of the ones they did last time around, and they'll feed that into the way they play them out this time. So, as I say, let's reserve judgment until we've seen a few more. Right, where are we? I'm going to have to wrap this up. What are your thoughts on teams asking for higher budget for 6 sprint races? This is always a really difficult one, isn't it? Because, look, I mean, you can justify that, can't you? There is much more mileage being done. There is more chance of crash damage being done, which adds massive cost, and that cost has to come out of your budget. So it's difficult to argue against that. The teams, of course, will look for any excuse to add a few more quid to the kitty, but I don't think this is just a flippant can we see if we can squeeze some more money out. The sprint races can add a significant amount onto your budget, even if nothing more than in just mileage. So yes, I kind of agree that that's probably something that should be discussed. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. But before I do, I just want to say, first of all, a massive thanks to all of you that joined tonight. It's the first one of the year for me. I've loved it. I hope you have too. We'll be doing it every week, same time, same place. And in the meantime, if you haven't seen it yet across my socials, my audio podcast, Pit Lane Life Lessons podcast, is back from today. So if you haven't checked that out, please do. If you've got a car journey, if you're going for a dog walk, whatever, stick the podcast on. And look, it's related to F1, but it's also related to the things that I go and talk about in my capacity as a public speaker. Lessons that I've learned from Formula One that I can share with you guys. So give it a try. If you don't mind subscribing, sharing, shouting about it, any of those things that I know you already do for me, which I really appreciate, that would be great. I hope you all have a brilliant week, and I will try my very best to get some car review videos to you as soon as possible. And by the way, you can also watch the podcast right here on YouTube if that's your thing. Either way, you can watch it. So listen, you'll hear from me at some point, probably at the weekend by the time I've got round to doing those videos, and then we'll be back here again on Monday night. That'll be halfway through car launch season and edging even closer towards pre-season testing. Just a few short weeks now before cars hit the track, whether we get to see them or not. And then before you know it, we'll be into a brand new season of racing. I can't wait. I know many of you can't too. In the meantime, folks, have a fantastic week. I really appreciate you joining, and I'll see you really soon. Ta-da!